Welcome, everyone, to the May 2021 edition of the Prehospital Care Research Forum Journal Club podcast. The Prehospital Care Research Forum, Pcrf, is dedicated to the promotion, education, and dissemination of prehospital research. And we believe it is the responsibility of emergency medical professionals worldwide to build a body of evidence to examine prehospital emergency care. And here with our Pcrf Journal Club, we take a closer look at some of the latest research happening in EMS. I'm Rimley Crow, and today I am joined by Dave Page, Dr. Tony Fernandez, Dr. Bill Toon, and Jeff Rollman. And it is my great pleasure to welcome one of the authors of our paper, Alex Moore. The name of the article that we're reviewing is the EMS Modified Early Warning Score, EMEWS, a simple count of vital signs as a predictor of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. And this was published, or still hot off the press in early view, in Prehospital Emergency Care. And as always, our discussion is paired with an article that's written by our very own columnist, Dr. Tony Fernandez, in EMS World called Journal Watch. So we encourage you all to go check out the article at emsworld.com under the category of education and training. I want to take a moment and thank the entire audience for being here with us today. As we begin, I want you to know that you can use the chat feature on your screen, type in questions and comments as you go. It's always a fun interactive discussion, so please pop in those questions. And I think with that, we're ready to get started. Another huge thank you for our author for taking the time to be here today. So Alex, let's have you introduce yourself for our audience members. We'd like to hear a little bit about who you are, what you do, and how you got involved with EMS research.
All right. So hi, everybody. My name is Alex Moore. I'm a paramedic in Spring, Texas at Cypress Creek EMS. Been a paramedic for about 10 years now. And I've always been interested in contributing to EMS research just because the body of research out there is pretty limited, and I'm a strong believer in evidence-based practice, and it's easier than you think it is to actually get involved in research and contribute, which is what I learned. I mean, this is my very first experience with any kind of published research. And I got a lot of help from Pcrf to do that, and I learned a ton throughout this process, and I'm excited to share it with you.
And we are so excited to have you here and that you took an interest and followed the research all the way through. And for our audience who might not be familiar with the opportunity you mentioned, you talked about the Pcrf Research Forum. And so I asked Dave Page if he wants to talk just a little bit about what these research forums are all about, and how the audience might be able to get involved if this is of interest.
You won't be able to shut me up. It's just
I know,
awesome.
I'm worried about doing this.
This is the mission fulfilled. We have the moment because Alex was at one of our workshops, and we do these workshops with all sorts of partners. What we try to do is kind of a speed dating concept where we put the right people in a room, and the brain trust shows up with not only researchers that know how to use the data that we have at our disposal, but plan research projects for the future. And in a short amount of time, we think up projects that can help people just even facilitate research. Just think about what it is that we are curious about and see if we have some pilot data or some retrospective data from large databases like the ESO database, but we also do it with the FISDAP database when it comes to education. We've done partnerships with state data repositories for this. And we also have future planning, so it doesn't need to be something that is immediately available. We help people dream up and plan a project for the future, help them collect the data, and then sometimes even do lock-ins where people after the event can get help writing up the project. So the idea is really to live our mission, which is to have EMS providers who can do research, read research, be familiar with it, not be so afraid of it. And it's just such a great moment today to see the fruits of that labor with Alex being able to tell us in plain paramedic language, why is it important, because this is at the moment where we dream up these things. Alex was sitting there going, well, I wish I knew which patients were going to go into cardiac arrest. And so here we are with a new concept of, could we better predict what patients might actually be crumping? And that's all about, you know, this collaborative event where the stats don't have to scare you and the ethics approvals don't have to scare you, and collecting the information doesn't have to scare you, because you have a team of people who want to see us succeed. So thank you, Alex, for coming on, and of course, Remley, for facilitating all this. And if I don't shut up now, all of the attendees who really want to know the answer about what the research is are going to be like, stop the infomercial. Okay.
Wait, stats scare people though? I want to highlight that point.
Yes, stats do scare people. They scare me to the nth degree. Is that a stat actually, or is that
I think
just
so. P less than 0.01. Okay, no
Oh,
more stats comments. We're going to
okay.
see the audience drop off.
Allergic reaction?
No, but I love that this is a truly collaborative process. And so, Alex, do you want to talk a little bit about the team you got paired up with and who helped work on this paper with you?
Absolutely. Like I said, I'm a total novice to this, and I wouldn't have gotten anywhere without my co-authors that did most of the real work on this. Dr. Brian Clemency attended this workshop with me. This is something that he was already kind of studying, was this EMS witness cardiac arrest, and he had done quite a bit of research into that phenomenon. And so he was a primary driver of the study, and we also worked with Dr. Lawrence Brown, who's been on countless papers and was extremely helpful in getting the methodology and statistics analysis done. And Dr. William Murk, who's up with Dr. Clemency in Buffalo, I believe, also helped. Did most of the work on the actual manuscript. So I was just kind of along for the ride, to be perfectly honest with you, and it was a great experience to work with these guys.
I think you're definitely along for more than just the ride, and it really is important to involve people who live and work in the field when we're doing this kind of research. So often I bring up the example of the parachute study where, you know, it was a randomized control trial of people jumping out of a plane with or without a parachute, and they found no difference, but setting made all of the difference because the plane happened to be on the ground. So of course nobody got injured, but you know, having somebody from the real world when we're doing these studies is incredibly important. And I know that your contributions were extremely important throughout. And I'm just super excited to talk about the work at hand. So Dave kind of hinted at it, but the objective of this study was to compare an already existing early warning score to a newly developed EMS specific early warning score, and looking at the ability to classify patients who are at risk for having a cardiac arrest in the presence of EMS, which is something that we've all experienced in the field, and you know, something we would have loved to have a little insight that it was coming before it did. So I'm curious about you know, the process of coming up with this idea. Was it something that you were previously interested in, or you know, how was that brainstorming session at the research forum that came up with this?
Yeah, so this is something that I'm a field training officer, and I've done a lot of work in quality improvement in my organization. And this phenomenon of EMS witness cardiac arrest is relatively uncommon, but it's obviously something where we have the potential to really impact these patients' prognosis if we catch it early and intervene, potentially even before they go into cardiac arrest. So one way or another, the more that we can anticipate patients decompensating, my thought was that we can better intervene.
Right, absolutely.
This is something along the lines of what Dr. Clemency has found in his research as well. So we kind of paired up to see what problems we could solve, basically. We initially started with the EMEWS score, which is the modified early warning score, and we're just going to evaluate that utility, or that score's utility in predicting this witness cardiac arrest. We also thought that it would be interesting to come up with something a little easier to calculate, because EMEWS is a weighted score you have to keep track of in your head, and the pre-hospital environment can get, bog you down a little bit. So alongside that, we also improvised a EMS specific early warning score, or EMEWS, and that's not a way to score. That's 1 point for every vital sign out of the normal range, and so comparing those alongside each other, we were able to demonstrate that their ability to differentiate was pretty similar, and both were pretty effective tests at identifying patients at risk.
Oh, and that has huge implications. A lot of these early warning scores involve complex algorithms. And you know what? This is a perfect lead in to go ahead and invite Dr. Tony Fernandez to join us so we can start to talk through some of these methods. And actually, if we go on to the next slide, this lays out both of the scores that were looked at. So we have the MEWS, which already existed, along with the EMEWS, which is this novel score that you just mentioned that was meant to simplify field application. So Tony, I'll turn it over to you to start talking through a little bit of the methods, and I'm going to hang out and pop in as well because I can't get away from methods. They're my favorite.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think this was a great study, and really thanks for joining us today. I think it was really interesting how you implemented the MEWS and how you came up with your own classification, the EMEWS. Can you talk a little bit about one of the things that I thought was really interesting was how you use the MEWS. And as we know, temperature is not often recorded in the pre-hospital environment. And I think you made a really good decision with what you did with this score. So can you walk us through a little bit of how you went about evaluating the score and some of the decision-making processes?
Yeah, so we were using the ESO research data set for 2018, I believe. I may actually have that wrong, but
No,
okay.
Yeah,
So we initially just tried to evaluate the full MEWS score, which does incorporate temperature, but it was missing in so many of the encounters that we were looking at evaluating that we decided to just evaluate the score without the temperature component altogether. That was just a function of the data we had available, but that compared with the improvised score had a relatively comparable performance.
And I think that's great. I mean, that shows that things don't have to be perfect, right? You don't have to you don't have to stop your study because you don't necessarily have all the data you're looking for. There are ways around it, and you can still come up with something that is really impactful and contributes to the literature like you did today. So I think that was a great choice. And you did kind of tee up my next question, which I appreciate that. It's like we worked that out ahead of time. You talked a little bit about the data set and where you this was a retrospective analysis and where you obtained those data. Remley and I are really familiar with this data set. So maybe Remley, I can take some of your time and maybe you can tell us about the ESO Data Collaborative and the data set that we work with pretty often.
Yeah, we just actually finished building 2020 data set. So the ESO Data Collaborative consists of all the EMS agencies who use ESO and have agreed to give their de-identified data for research and benchmarking for projects exactly like this. And so each year, Tony and I build a standard core data set, really similar to what the NEMSIS public use research data set is. There's of course advantages and disadvantages to this data set, and it's important to think about, is the question at hand appropriate for the data that we have, and what might be different between, the ESO data set and other data sets that are out there like NEMSIS. So in terms of hospital outcome data, this data set has a bunch of linked records where we can see the patient's final diagnosis. We can see things like length of stay and what was their ultimate disposition, really helpful for some of these studies. It's something that anyone can request. So from the ESO website, there's a research tab, and then of course it has to go through an external review process. And actually Lawrence Brown, who worked on this project with Alex, is one of our research leadership group members, along with 8 or 9 others who they're just looking to make sure that the question is appropriate for the data set and that we're not likely to reach any improper conclusions by using a retrospective data set. And then of course, there's that process of institutional review board approval and data use authorizations. So It is a great process. It's a great time to team up with people and find some of these mentors and clinical people to work with. But I think in 2020, what was it, Tony? About 9 million EMS records were available. And of course, one of the pros to this data set is that all of the data got collected in the same way through the same software. One of the cons to the data set is in terms of potential for generalizability. So is there geographic differences that may affect the question at hand, or urban-rural distributions that may affect the question at hand? And these are all things we walk through during the process of requesting that data set, just to make sure. Did I leave anything out there, Tony?
No, I think that's great. I do want to highlight again that this is not the data set also has outcomes, and in 2020 we've got about 1 million of those linked to the EMS record. So it really is a wealth of data that's available for you. So it's a great data source, and Alex, I'm happy that you use the 2018 data set to publish this great work. So let's move back into the study. So again, the data set was huge, and there was one of the really important things I think that you made some good decisions on were your inclusion exclusion criteria. So in other words, what patients were you actually going to analyze, and what patients were you going to remove from your data set? Can you talk to us a little bit about those inclusion exclusion criteria? And what I'm really interested in is your thought process and how you worked through those decisions.
Yeah. So we did exclude the pediatric patients. It's just kind of a standard. We're really just focused on adult patients. This data set also includes non-emergency, non-911 transports, and we did exclude all of those. So we really wanted to look at just 911 adult patients. The other thing that we decided to do, we debated it for a little while, but we decided to exclude trauma patients because we felt like their progression on the curve, I guess, and their how fast they're likely to decompensate is probably different and wouldn't necessarily track with a more medical patient. And so this is 911 scene call medical patient adults.
Perfect.
Yeah, that was great. And one of the other exclusion criteria that I thought were really interesting were your exclusion criteria for cases without at least one pre-arrest vital sign. Can you talk to us a little bit about just explaining that further and why you decided that was important?
Right. Yeah. So that came up because it was kind of a core decision. A big debate that we had was whether the absence of a vital sign indicated something bad or something good. And to get around a lot of that, we decided to exclude patients that didn't have any documented vital signs, or at least one of each of the necessary for the score prior to a cardiac arrest, because we felt like we couldn't necessarily guarantee that they weren't actually in cardiac arrest prior to arriving. This way, we had a way to build a score prior to the actual cardiac arrest and use it to differentiate.
Yeah, and I'm sure for folks listening, that sounds like well, duh, of course you're going to do that, right? But that's not as easy as it sounds to work through and to come to that decision. I'm sure there were a lot of conversations and a lot of back and forth that had to do with those decisions. Along the same line, with when you're talking about data and what you used and what was missing, I thought it was really cool that when your APCU was missing, how you use GCS or Glasgow Coma scores to fill in that missing, and that was I'll geek out and I'll tell you that was just neat, and I hadn't seen that before. And if you could tell our audience a little bit about how you did that, I think that'd be useful.
Yeah, that was again, this was something that we were running into for a lot of these records, because we were just maybe the GCS was documented, but the APCU wasn't, because they're in two different fields, or vice versa. And yeah, I think it was Lawrence Brown's suggestion that we could essentially just correlate a certain GCS to an APU and just kind of improvise a range to equivocate. That's a word.
It is now.
And that allowed us to look at quite a few records. It's a substantial amount that we otherwise would have had to exclude because of missing fields.
Yeah, and well, just to walk through that, I think that was really, so you used GCS of 15 was considered alert, 12 to 14 was considered verbally responsive, 7 to 11 was considered painfully responsive, and then 6 or less was considered unresponsive. And I think that was novel. I really thought that was a unique decision to make.
I know Tony's taken that for future studies.
So that's why I'm mentioning it so much. But yeah, I'll cite you, so it'll work out just fine. So the other thing that you did that I thought was interesting was your decision about lights and sirens, and how you defined folks who are critical as transport by lights and sirens. And there are different agency policies and system policies that have to do with lights and sirens. I think it was a wise decision, but again, being that this was your first research project, I'd really like to go through how that experience was for you and the decision making related to that specific criteria.
Yeah, that was something that we went back and forth on a lot. I know we looked at comparisons to that group as well as to all transports, including non-emergency transport. But the idea was to try to find some proxy for the provider thinks this patient is really sick. So if a score doesn't help you beyond your intuition as a paramedic that, yeah, this patient's actually really sick and I need to be concerned about them, if it doesn't add anything, then what's the point, right? So that was the best proxy that we could come up with for that provider gestalt that the patients were critical. I think we could probably, if we kept digging, we could probably find something that would be an even better proxy for that. But I do think that one did help pull a lot out of that data.
Absolutely.
And I think that might surprise people, the lay public. If I asked the lay public to guess, for example, what % of, all EMS transports do you think are lights and siren to the hospital? I would guess the public would guess a pretty high number. Whereas, this has been a safety focus through NEMSQA for quite a few years now, as well as just individual NHTSA initiatives related to judicious use of lights and siren. And so I would be curious, I kind of want to ask the audience to pop guesses in the chat, but what % of EMS transports do you think are with lights and siren? And how that helped you weed out this study? Because I think going into this, a few years ago, I would have said, oh, that probably weeded out like nobody. But in this case, I'm guessing that you probably pulled out 80% of all the records in there. We saw we do some benchmarking in the index this year. I think it was something like 83% of transports were without lights and siren. So for those who are sitting there thinking, oh, this, you didn't really weed anyone out, that's not actually what the data are telling us these days. We are making that move towards judicious use of lights and siren. I think this is a really great opportunity to highlight that. And it was a great proxy variable.
Agreed, 100% agreed. So before we dig into some stats and really start to geek out, I do want to talk about how your definition for delayed witness arrest, and why you thought that was important. Again, a lot of really smart decisions in this study, but this one I think bears some more conversation as well.
So the delayed, remind me exactly what you're looking at. Sorry.
So it was so when you evaluated, you looked at anyone who arrested 10 minutes after, and basically, why did you think that separate distinction was so important?
Yeah, so we broke those out because the idea was that patients that are rested in fewer than 10 minutes may not have been an opportunity for us or for the providers to intervene. Whether there was time for them to perform some kind of intervention or not, it was just likely that patient was too sick and was just going to go into cardiac arrest anyway. Past 10 minutes was this thought. Maybe that's enough time for an opportunity for an intervention to be performed, or maybe that patient was a little more of a surprise, right? You're with them for more than 10 minutes and then they decompensated. And so differentiating those is kind of that, were they going to arrest anyway, or maybe we could have done something differently.
Yeah, and you made a really good point about you looked at first recorded vital signs, and if they arrested 10 minutes out, how that may skew your evaluations a little bit. So I thought that was again a lot of really smart choices here. So I'd like to bring in Jeff Rollman, and I want to talk a little bit amongst the four of us about some of these, how you evaluated your test characteristics. And Jeff, if you could kind of walk us through some of the analysis that was done in terms of the area under the curve and sensitivity and specificity analyses, I think that would really help our audience understand, really dive deep into the results of this paper.
Sure, thank you. Happy to do that. And again, pleasure to be on this with all of you. Thank you, Alex, for joining us. Before we get into that, actually, I wanted to just go over one important point. Tony and Remley covered a lot of really smart decisions that you made. And another really interesting and smart decision was around missing data. That's something that we definitely struggle with in research and EMS record keeping. We're not always able to capture data. Maybe it's not taken, the vital signs, maybe it's not recorded. If you could just tell us a little bit about your thought process, Alex, in terms of what you did with missing data and how you handled it here. Thank you.
Yeah, so I had the advantage of I use ESO in my regular job. I'm a field paramedic and we use ESO where I work. So I have all that, I know what fields are there, and I know it's easy for me to kind of come up with options as far as what to replace things with, or what novel ways we could look at certain variables. As far as the scoring decisions for how to calculate the score with missing fields, that was probably one of the biggest things that we wrestled with was if that field is missing, do we assume that it's good or do we assume that it's bad? And the interesting thing was that neither of those options really impacted the results a ton, which kind of confused me, to be honest, because I definitely would have assumed that if we just played them all off as good, then it would have skewed the results. But yeah, it was probably one of the more complicated things that we had to.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense with what you did. You basically just assumed that if that value isn't recorded, it's probably because this patient is so critical that don't even have time or not able to obtain a blood pressure cuff, or sorry, not able to obtain the value from that blood pressure.
Missing data is always contentious. I know Jeff knows that too. So it was interesting to me as well that this was looked at in a bunch of different ways. And I think something that Alex said is really important to pull out is that it didn't seem to influence the results. So we're going to talk a little bit about sensitivity analyses, not to be confused with what Jeff's about to talk about with sensitivity and specificity. But it's a little reassuring when you get the same answer through a bunch of different ways of looking at something. And so I'm really glad that you all took the time, which it is tedious to look at things in all of these different models and these different ways, but definitely worthwhile to share that transparent look at the data. So excellent work there.
Yeah, so I guess moving on to the EMEWS calculation, we could all see in table 2, basically the highest value, the highest calculated score is 4, and the lowest would be 0, someone who has perfect vital signs and is alert. And then when we're thinking of these sort of diagnostic tests, being able to diagnose someone as having an impending cardiac arrest, we want to be thinking about our score cutoffs. And we know that if we have a very high cutoff, then we're going to have fewer false negatives. So we're not going to be saying that someone is probably going to have a cardiac arrest when they're not going to. Whereas if we have a very low score cutoff, we'll have a better time catching all these potential cardiac arrests. But then at the same time, we'll catch a ton of other patients that are unlikely to arrest. So these, in terms of catching and not catching patients, this refers to sensitivity and specificity. So sensitivity is a word which is thrown around a lot in research, and we definitely see it in this paper in particular. So sensitivity is our true positive rate. So it's our probability that the EMEWS, that test result would be positive when the impending cardiac arrest happens, when it's present. Whereas specificity is our true negative rate. So it's the probability that our EMEWS test result would be negative, meaning that we'd have a low EMEWS when the impending cardiac arrest is not present. So we're trying to kind of get a balance. We definitely want to have our test be as sensitive and have the highest specificity as possible. But we know that in the real world, there's usually trade-offs. And this area under a curve, which I don't think there's a slide on this, but the area under a curve is a measure where we look at accuracy of quantitative diagnostic tests that involve numerical cutoffs, like the EMEWS. And this basically plots this true positive rate, the sensitivity, against the false positive rate, so 1 minus this specificity. And then that allows us to visually see these trade-offs in how we're looking at our accuracy. So if we have kind of a straight diagonal line, that would just mean that our test is no better than chance and kind of just random. And an area under the curve of 1 would mean that our test is perfectly accurate. It can predict every impending cardiac arrest. And then if it's not an impending cardiac arrest, it'll be able to differentiate between that. So here, what we're really trying to do is pick that ideal number threshold. So I don't know if there's anything you wanted to jump in about sort of that process of picking that threshold, or I'm happy to go a little bit further.
That's where the professional statistician came in for sure. So that was the Dr. Brown thing. That I know that was I don't remember. I think we pretty much always came up with the optimal cut point of 2 for the EMEWS. I think there was one thing that we were looking at where we might have had it up to 3. But yeah, that was just a statistical calculation given the data that we had, that it was 2 or greater was the optimal cut point for the EMEWS.
And that's one of the great things about these research, the Pcrf research forums, is you don't necessarily have to have an in-depth stat background because you have those resources in the research forum. So it is, I'm sure that was really helpful and eye-opening, because I bet you learned a lot.
Well, and as your friendly neighborhood epidemiologist, I'm not too ashamed to admit that I still have to Google which one's sensitivity, which one's positive predictive value, and get my head straight before I calculate all of these. There's a lot of time spent on Google, even among the statisticians.
Absolutely, no doubt. So before we move on to our results, which are fascinating, I'd like to give any other panelists the opportunity to ask some methods-related questions. And if not, we'll dive right into the results. Thanks, Alex. This is a great paper.
We do have a couple of questions from the audience. Perhaps we could pause and take one of those, or maybe two of those. Someone mentioned I had said a bunch of acronyms because we know that we seriously love some acronyms in EMS. So when I was mentioning performance measurement in EMS, I threw out NEMSQA, which is the National EMS Quality Alliance. And so if you go to nemsqa.org, we can see there's a suite of 11 EMS performance measures there, which is really cool because we're long past the days of only measuring response time as our performance indicators. So things like safety measures, lights and siren use are definitely on there, along with some other cool measures worth checking out. And I mentioned NHTSA too, which is the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. So we know EMS has a history of being in the Department of Transportation, and NHTSA also developed some of those initial performance measures worth checking out as well. So please always send in those questions if I say something that I haven't clarified, because so used to just rolling those off the tongue. And our second question here, Tony, I'm going to direct this one to you because it's about your favorite part of the paper, the AVPU to GCS conversion. Tim asks us, he's wondering when comparing AVPU to GCS, would it be more accurate perhaps to just assess the I section only? Verbal looks at orientation as opposed to just something like alert. So is this a launching point for future work looking at that conversion between GCS and AVPU? What do you think?
I think absolutely. I think it would be to do an in-depth comparison between GCS and AVPU. That's not something I've seen, and that's absolutely, I think, would be useful in terms of missing data, which we know we'll always have to deal with to some extent.
Yeah, I think this opens up a super cool line of future work. Come to a research forum, maybe we can do this one.
Absolutely, I'll work with you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, okay. So definitely keep those questions coming, audience. I am just really excited for the participation we're seeing. And with that, I know we're gonna get to the part that people wanna get to. Let's talk about some of these results. So we can go ahead and switch to the next set of tables. Overall, this data set was not small, even after limiting to just those who were deemed critical or unstable, as well as EMS witness arrest. So just to give the audience a little bit of background on this, there were over 350,000 patients included in the sample, so definitely not something you're going to be doing in Excel. You'll definitely need to partner up with somebody who uses a stats package, whether that be R or obviously the best stats package data. And I think it's worth noting too, over 4,600 of these patients had the EMS witnessed cardiac arrest. So we might feel like that's a rare event. However, there was a substantial number in this data set when we pool all of the agency data together that allowed us to study this kind of question. Taking a look at table 3, and I'll let you talk a little bit about this, Alex. This is our patient demographics and the clinical characteristics, looking just comparison at critical and unstable patients versus the EMS witnessed arrest patients. And I'll give you first dibs on, is there anything in there that you want to call out, or why do you feel it's important to just take this, cross-sectional look at the two groups of patients here?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, anytime you're going to use a big data set like this, you want to be able to compare the individual breakdowns of the demographics to make sure that nothing in there is skewing your results in general to everybody. And this, this data set actually kind of, or this analysis actually kind of fell pretty evenly across the board, which is interesting. And the biggest surprise to me is actually, like you mentioned, the prevalence of the EMS witness cardiac arrest among these critical patients. It's something that doesn't happen to everybody, even once in their entire career, but something that is got to be ready for it. So it's a lot more common than I had initially thought going into this. But that's still the main thing that drives me crazy about this whole project, is just how prevalent it really was.
Yeah, that stuck out to me right away as well. And I think it's really nice that you did the breakdown of this table, because for future work that might want to do something similar and replicate your analysis, having this breakdown kind of tells us, are we dealing with the same population in terms of, patient age looks similar between the groups. So does the sex breakdown. Paramedic level of care might have been higher than I would have expected. So we're talking about 80% had paramedic level care available. I think the urbanicity breakdown was a really wise choice as well. We talk about these urban-rural care disparities all the time, and we can see that, a larger proportion of those in the suburban rural category had the EMS witnessed arrest. And I can hypothesize maybe that's because we spent more time with those patients, and also there tends to be more limited access to medical care in some of the more rural or frontier settings. So I think that this is, I could see a whole paper generating just off of that topic alone. And then perhaps it wasn't as surprising to see that when we're talking about chief complaint system, more of the cardiac arrest occurred among patients with a cardiac etiology, which could be suspected, right?
Yeah.
All right, so let's take a look at our next slide, which is table 4, because I think this was a really cool look at just the breakdown of your different strata. So taking a look at the count of abnormal vital signs, which I want to emphasize again, how this, it sounds like such a simple approach, but it's a really novel way of looking at this. Just a yes/no variable for how many abnormal vitals do you have is something, even as chaotic as the scene might be, I can probably quickly do that count versus trying to sit here and calculate a weighted score would be really challenging. And so when we look at the breakdown of abnormal vital signs, I think it's reassuring to see that the smaller numbers are at the extreme. So we have less people with the 0 abnormal vital signs, which makes sense since these were critical or unstable patients. And then when we look at the extreme value of 4 abnormal vital signs, again, it's a smaller value. And then what I thought you did really interestingly here is walk through how each one, as you add more abnormal vital signs, you're seeing more EMS witnessed arrests per 1,000 patients. And I'd like to highlight the conversion of EMS arrests per 1,000 patients lets us compare the different ranges versus just trying to do a proportion there. So I think that was a great way. And this shocked me. I don't know if you have any comments on it, but ranging from 3.3 cardiac arrests EMS witnessed per 1,000 patients when there's 0 abnormal vital signs on initial contact, all the way to 55 per 1,000 patients when we have 4 abnormal vital signs. Definitely eye-opening for me. Anything you want to call out there, Alex?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just speaks to something that we've always been taught, but it's hard to put into numbers, that it's not really about how bad one single vital sign is necessarily, but multiple different vitals. If you have issues with your blood pressure, heart rate, and your respiratory rate, or your SpO2, I mean, all of these things start adding into the picture, and at that point, it's much worse than just one of those parameters being way off the charts.
Right, there's this like stack up effect.
Right.
Yeah. I think that's an excellent way of looking at it. And then really table 5 is where we get into the meat of the analysis. So what Jeff Rollman was talking about on the next slide is the test characteristics overall, and then broken down by specific presentations. So this was the sensitivity analysis, not to be confused with the sensitivity of the test. And all that means is taking different subgroups of the analysis and seeing how the answer differs if it does differ. So I'll let you have first stab. Are there some key takeaways that you want to pull out for our audience here? And I'll share some of my own as well.
So, I mean, the thing that really surprised me was overall how EMEWS compared to the MEWS minus temperature score. I know there's been a lot of interest in adopting some of these risk assessment scores in the pre-hospital environment, but in this particular case for this use, the EMEWS, the improvised kind of vital sign score, is roughly comparable to the MEWS, and so spending the time to figure the score out and add it up in your head is actually probably counterproductive. And
right.
That kind of thing is one of the biggest takeaways for me, and just that the degree to which this improvised score compared to an established score was pretty surprising.
I agree. And, you know, the values that we're seeing for area under the curve here are, you know, in the 0.7 to 0.8 range, which I know that Jeff mentioned, you know, 0.5 is a coin flip. It means the test does no better than a coin flip. And then as you get to 0.7, that's considered an acceptable range. And then 0.9 is phenomenal. And that's a wonderful test. Just to put things in perspective for our audience here, a lot of the stroke scales that we're using routinely also fall in this range. They're about a 0.7. So if we're comfortable using the stroke scales, we should feel comfortable using something like this that has a 0.7. And I also thought it was really important that this performs as well as that more complex weighted score. So sometimes simpler truly can be better, especially when we're talking about curbside application rather than bedside. So that's also important. Another thing I want to compliment your author team on is not overemphasizing statistical significance. So this paper is very focused, as it should be, on clinical relevance. Here we see that there's actually a statistical difference between MEWS and EMEWS, but it's not clinically practical, and so that's not emphasized. The confidence intervals tell us that it's there, but when you're talking about a data set of 300,000 patients, you're going to see statistical significance, and it's really important just to keep this in mind. Is a 0.79 really different from a 0.74? In practical terms, probably not. So I think the authors did a great job at helping reach that conclusion and doing a really good job in the discussion and implications of this work. I think the only other thing I wanted to highlight down there is that when it comes to the different breakdowns, we don't see any differences either. So you looked at paramedic attended events only, the delayed EMS witnessed arrest, which that one we did see a slight drop on the area under the curve. And that kind of makes sense to me. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this because you're further away from when that initial set of vitals was taken. So there was time to intervene and do things there that could have actually changed the trajectory of the patients. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's probably what's going on. I think it would be really interesting to look specifically at timelines of when these arrests occurred, but I think that's a question for another day.
Well, you know, there's a lot of other questions that can be asked. And so this is a great framework for asking these future questions. And I like that you also didn't try to do it all in one paper, because that's also a temptation, right? I've got to answer every question. No. I tell people I have to put a sticky note on my computer screen with my objective for my study. And if it's not that objective, I'm not allowed to answer it. I have to put it in a parking lot. Because I think the data are all there and it's super tempting to just keep looking at different questions. And we're getting a question from the audience, I think is a good time to bring it in, from Chris, about the rate of arrest in patients with non-cardiac, non-pulmonary medical complaints and the clinical significance of screening tests with this kind of sensitivity. So we definitely saw in the earlier tables that the cardiac complaints were more likely to arrest, but there was still a substantial number in the other chief complaint groups. And in terms of, you know, what's the sensitivity of 80% really mean? Well, that is, you're capturing with just this simple score over 80% of patients who arrest in EMS care. And so in terms of how this compares to like a stroke screen, this is right on par with capturing large vessel occlusion stroke and some of those other things. So if it was me in the field, I would say I'd feel pretty comfortable using this as a quick gut check on, should I be ready for an arrest? Should I get out more equipment? Should I be thinking about some way to intervene? And the next step, I think, is really to see if we intervene and the vital signs change, does the probability of arrest then change?
Right.
Anything I left out there, Alex, that you want to comment on?
No, I think that definitely, I mean, that really hits the practical application of this in my mind is it's a gut check. You know, it's just using it to kind of temper yourself a little bit. I mean, we as EMS providers, we get a little bit jaded sometimes, and you know, you start seeing hundreds of patients, and most of them pretty much end up fine at the hospital. And this is a good way of kind of reminding yourself that, you know what, maybe I should not fall asleep on this one.
Definitely a good quick check too, and I like that. And then the last table here on the next slide is table 7. This looks at the breakdown of the individual vital signs of the included patients. And I think you've already kind of mentioned this, but it wasn't like there's one magic bullet vital sign, that it's actually the stack up of vital signs. Were there any findings with regards to any single vital sign that you wanted to call out or that surprised you in particular?
I mean, I definitely think that the degree of significance of the mental status and or the GCS, to me that was intuitive, but I like to be able to see that mapped out, because that's something that I always kind of intuitively feel like that's one of the more significant vital signs. But
Absolutely. And for our audience, this might be small text. So I'm going to, it's 6% of patients had an Glasgow initially below 14 or an AVPU not equal to A in the critical unstable group. So 6%, or rather 14%, excuse me. And then 51% of the EMS witnessed arrests had an initial Glasgow under 14 or an AVPU not equal to A. So half of those patients started off with an abnormal score in the mental status. And I think that's an important finding. Great highlight there. I know that we also put a lot of emphasis on systolic blood pressure, particularly with certain types of patients like sepsis patients. And so it checked out for me, talking about that clinical gestalt, if you will. Around 6% of patients in that critical unstable group had the initial blood pressure below 90 compared to 22% in that group that had the EMS witness arrest. So it's also good to see when the data support what we kind of clinically knew, but nice to have the data to support that. And I'll definitely invite our other authors to join, or our other panelists to join and ask in some questions. I do have a few more, and I know we're running out of time, but this is such an excellent paper and so many exciting things. I would be remiss if we don't talk a little bit about limitations in research. So I know when you're starting out in research, you might be hesitant to admit those limitations, but it's actually a really normal thing. All studies have limitations, especially retrospective studies. And so were there any limitations that you think the audience needs to take into account while they're reading this work, or that you might have been surprised to have to report in the peer-reviewed paper?
oh yeah, absolutely. So I mean, it's a retrospective, and it's based off of EMS documentation. And so anybody who's had a job at EMS for a little while knows that sometimes that documentation may not be as reliable as data that you specifically collected yourself prospectively. So there's that. And then the other thing that is almost kind of hard for me to wrap my head around while we were playing with this paper was that while these scores do a pretty good job of differentiating patients at risk for EMS witness cardiac arrest, they're not great at giving you a predictive value, right? It's a pretty rare thing, and it's hard to say that, oh, well, because this patient's score is positive or has a 3 or 4, that they're this many more times likely to arrest in your care. And that's something that I would really like to see in the future, as as we maybe integrate more vital parameters and things like that into types of scores.
Super important.
I want to congratulate you. I love your work, and I also think we should confirm those gut checks. So a takeaway for me is if somebody's unresponsive with a low blood pressure, I'm really going to be hyper alert, right? And I also I really appreciate the humility behind these numbers. The automatic blood pressure cuffs, for example, are picking up all sorts of weird numbers, and they're feeding right into the electronic reporting systems. And so some of the metrics we use may need to change. And we did a podcast with Vic Convertino a few years ago about how that sort of area under the curve, the mean arterial pressure, intersects with some machine learning algorithms that would predict this a bit better. And I still think that guy is going to probably earn a Nobel Prize around that. So look at Convertino's work on the shock index and compare it to what we've got here, and simplicity really wins the day. I also want to say that Bill Toon, though he's being a turkey and won't turn on his camera, I think he has a comment too.
It's not a turkey. You told me I can't have my muscle shirts on the video. So I know, just getting back from the gym. So help me understand here a little bit. First of all, thank you. This is just beautiful work. I, Remley is geeky about things, but when I see papers like this, I'm equally as geeky. And you've done excellent work to take the time to put this together and project it. But since we already know a post-cardiac arrest patient is a high-risk patient, don't you normally put into place, or at least the system that I spent a great deal of time, is we had a post-cardiac arrest checklist. It ran down what was expected to be monitored and put in place, including additional personnel taken during transport. Now, we were a resource-rich community, so I understand, and I've also worked in those locations where I'm the only paramedic in the back and there's an EMT driver, and that's it. There is no other resource to gather, and so I'm trying to look at the pragmatic part of this. I already look at these as high-risk patients. I already look at that I have to be on my best behavior and everything. So do we see this score really as a practical application or a research tool?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. My initial read of this, when I finally kind of processed all the results, was that it is a little less of a practical tool and more of a kind of just an internal barometer, I guess. It's just a way to kind of reaffirm your intuition that you picked up just with seeing patients for so long. But I do think that it has, this type of research has the potential to either, whether it's integrated into a computerized system that's actually an algorithm in the monitor, or something of that vein, to be able to make some more practical changes to practice.
Again, I think in a resource limited environment that certainly could probably have a greater impact, and we shouldn't ignore that probably a lot of EMS systems run on the leaner side and not on the plus side. And so to probably be able to predict, so you can rationalize out to supervision or whatever it is, taking a second ambulance out of service to get the right manpower, there's probably is that practicality. And I do think automation, reliable automation of this in the future would be greatly valuable, particularly as further validation takes place. But beautiful work. Thank you so much for doing this. And I do see so many great other things coming out of what you've pieced together here.
I agree 100%. And we're getting down to the last few moments of the podcast, but I want to know about your experience in research overall. So getting to peer review manuscript is definitely not an easy feat. So congratulations. I mean, that's just huge to have done this outside of your main job. Was there anything that surprised you throughout this research process, from drafting the abstract, presenting the abstract findings, to going through that peer review publication process?
I mean, I think the biggest thing that surprised me was just how many resources were out there and how many, what kind of support there was for this type of activity. I would have thought going into it that this was going to have to be, I drive this myself. If I wanted, I really have to do 100% of it on my own, or with very little help, and that was absolutely not the case. I mean, it was a pretty amazing community around this EMS research, and the support for this project was enormous. And without it, I wouldn't have known where to start. So that was by far the most surprising thing to me.
Well, I think kudos to you for taking that first step and getting over the intimidation factor. And, I encourage others in the audience to do the same, to reach out to the Pcrf. There's a whole board of people willing to help these kinds of questions and projects, and having field influence in the papers. I can't emphasize enough how important that actually is. I'm curious, has this shaped your thoughts around the importance of EMS documentation at all?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's largely my responsibility in my agency to kind of oversee that, and knowing that I could use our data in our responses in the future for research. I really plead with people to carefully fill all that out and put as much data in there as accurately as possible. But
Yeah, makes a huge difference. And I saw Bill flash his muscle shirt. I don't know if he had a question or just wanted to show muscles.
Someone was texting me some rude comments. I won't mention who that was.
Dave Page. Okay, now you're killing the end here. Dave, do you have a last question to wrap us up? Or...
And just a comment. Just a comment about the usefulness of keeping things simple and just the approach of that. Let's confirm what our gut checks are telling us and look forward to more work from you. The inevitable research opens the question to more questions, and don't shy away, because the support is here. And for those that are listening, we have a really talented group of advisors and board members who all want to help EMS do research. So thank you.
That's a great comment, and it applies to so many other areas in EMS screening. So we've seen with like the stroke screening tools are often complex, and we recently looked at, does the Cincinnati perform as well or better when you grade them yes, no, just face, arm, speech, right? So I can see this being the launching point for a lot of other studies like that. And now, sadly, this has flown by, and it's been a really great and fun conversation. So thanks again for taking the time. I'll let you have the last word in terms of, do you have any advice for other EMS clinicians who might want to dabble in the world of EMS research?
Yeah, absolutely. If you can get to one of these forums, that's going to be your best bet, obviously. But other than that, just reach out and ask people. Send emails, go onto Twitter and follow Remley and everybody else, and
you'll get some good memes here and there.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you again, Alex. Can't thank you enough. Again, this is all outside of your normal EMS clinician job, so I can't thank you enough for sharing not only your peer-reviewed research, which is again an incredible feat, congratulations, but for taking the time to explain your work with our audience. This has been an awesome discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, I've got to take us out of here. So as a reminder to all of you, we've got the Education Research Journal Club podcast later this month, Friday, May 28th. And we're going to be right back here with our clinical podcast second Monday of the month, which is already June 14th. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to talking about research with you all next time.